Hi, I'm David Overton, and this is the Adventure Habits podcast, where we interview some of the finest adventurers in the world, some of which we've had the privilege to make maps for at Splash Maps, and we try and crystallise out of them their 5 adventure habits that you can take to make your life better. And I'm really thrilled this week to have someone a bit different on the podcast. We've got Kirsty Gittins, who's here with us. Kirsty, hi, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really excited, looking forward to it.
Well, I think it's so much fun because Kirsty is an expert really with dealing with getting kids into leadership, etc. She works for a company called ESG Education, and they're on a mission to inspire greatness in every child. And so that for me is so exciting because when I started this podcast, I was inspired by 2 things. So one thing was the adventurers, and the other thing was the idea that you could have habits that actually help to shape your life. And that's largely based upon this book, which is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Written by Stephen R. Covey and published by Franklin Covey. And on your business card here, it says Franklin Covey Education. So that's enough of an introduction for you to just tell us, what is Franklin Covey and how are you involved with getting the 7 habits into kids' brains?
Well, I have been a teacher for 27 years. I was teaching PE as my main subject. But during that time, I never really just saw it about my subject. I always saw it about the whole child. And I really saw PE as a vehicle through which I could challenge and help to shape character within my students. But over the years, I was finding more and more children were struggling with mental health and struggling with self-confidence. And so I happened to stumble across the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People book. And as soon as I read it, I thought, why are we not teaching this? Why are we not sharing this? Because if I had known those habits when I was their age, and I then discovered there was a teenage version. So I read that book and then I knocked on my head teacher's door and I said, please, will you let me start teaching this? And luckily enough for me, he said yes. Fast forward a few years, having done that for 12 years, ESG Education took on the licence for the whole of the UK from Franklin and Covey. And so we work with schools anywhere in the UK, not just schools, all the way down to preschool and all the way up to university. Any part of education we can work, which is wonderful. And
this book, I'm going to do a rubbish way of explaining it now, but I picked it up in my 20s, which was a good long time ago, half a lifetime ago for me. It kind of crystallizes down to 7 habits, the things that you can do to make your life much more effective and enjoyable, in fact. And it's principle-based rather than being pulled around by the ebbs and flows that happen in life when you interact with other people. So it's about having that good basis in the first place. How do you get something like that, which seems like quite an adult concept, into a child's mind? I mean, how do you get, if we take habit 1 that I've been reading about recently, proactivity, you're talking about expanding out your circle of influence into your circle of concern. I mean, how do you even get that into the language when you're teaching kids?
Well, the first thing that happens is a paradigm shift from you personally when you're working with children. Is if we have a belief that they are too little, that they can't understand, then that shapes what we do and then ultimately the results that we get. And we always work around this see, do, get model of the way you see something drives your behaviour. So straight away, if you're looking at the children and you're seeing them in a different way, if you're able to see their genius, if you're able to accept that they can understand most of what we're talking about, and we massively underestimate children. So, I've worked with 3-year-olds who can get these concepts. But it is about delivery. You're absolutely right, it's about delivery, and you've got to get that pitched at the right level. So, for example, with being proactive, you mentioned about the circle of influence and the circle of concern. Well, with the children, we might simplify that to circle of control and circle of no control, so that they understand that concept. But what we aim to do is for it, instead of it just being a habit in terms of that they can name those things and talk about them, we want them to think differently.
Yeah.
And so the more we can weave it into every part of the things they're doing, the more they start to think that way. So for example, you could be reading them a story, you know, and there's always characters within stories where you could ask the children, in this situation, you know, what's in their control? What can't they control? And what happens if they focus on those things they can't control? Does anything change? And it's all about coaching. It's all about asking questions and helping the children fill in the gaps. But another example would be you could be teaching them about, I don't know, World War II in history, and you could be talking to them about what it was like to be an evacuee. And you just ask the children, draw 2 massive circles, like a big donut, and in the outer circle, just write down all the things that child as a evacuee would have had no control over.
Yeah,
and
like Hitler and dropping bombs and all that sort of stuff.
You know, where they were going, you know, they were put on trains, they were sent out. What could they take with them? Were they ever going to see their families again? And so we asked them then to think, okay, but what could they control? What did they, on a day-to-day basis, have some influence over that help them to survive and be resilient in those circumstances? So the children then start to think, well, I suppose they could decide whether they wrote to their parents. They could decide whether they chose to make new friends in the new place whether they smiled at people, all those things that were within their control. And the children began to realise that actually the definition of insanity is to focus on things you can't control. And actually, if you can focus on something that's in your influence, you will feel better, you will make better decisions. And that's just a simple example, but it relates to so many different aspects of the children's lives.
And of course this holds true to adventure as
Absolutely.
well. I mean, you'd only get into adventure in the first place if you weren't distracted by all the other things in the world, and you wanted to be single-pointed about something, and then you would make sure that you can expand your influence over what it is you're taking on.
But you think about adventure, and I'm sure lots of the people you're interviewing, they had ideas, had great aspirations, they wanted to achieve something, but absolutely every single one of them would have come up across barriers, challenges, things that could have stopped them doing what they eventually achieved. And somebody who is proactive, somebody who focuses on their circle of influence, doesn't ignore the fact that there's a barrier. They acknowledge it, they accept it, but they choose to focus on what they can influence. So for me, you know, when I wanted to go travelling, backpacking when I was young, I didn't have anybody to go with. I didn't have any money. Most of my friends were telling me, you know, you're crazy to be leaving the country and going off to India on your own. All of those were barriers, but it's that mentality of, do I see them as barriers or do I just go and get a ladder and climb over? You know, it's the way you look at the situation.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, so it sounds like, I mean, what was for you? I mean, you're an adventurer, and you've kind of adopted these habits, and I'm just wondering what was the thing that took you down that adventure, the line, the thing that perhaps was in your childhood at the same age as the kids that you've been inspiring.
Well, I think my parents were a big influence, but in particular my dad, because growing up, I'm from Glastonbury in Somerset. It's a small town. It's a very eclectic town. It's got lots of different types of people. It draws lots of people. But as a country bumpkin, you don't necessarily see the outside world. You don't necessarily aspire to go to other countries. But what my dad did is he set up a play scheme, just an ordinary play scheme, started with 20 children, turning up in a half term, and grew to over 300 children coming for the summer holidays. And what he wanted to do was get children to really see outside of their immediate circumstances. So he started to invite people from all over the world to come and volunteer at the play scheme. So we started, and we did it for 10 years. Of every year there would be 20 internationals come and sleep on the school floor. We had mattresses for them. They used the home ec room.
Sounds crazy.
Home ec room was their kitchen. During the day they volunteered on the play scheme and worked with children from 5 upwards, and then in the evenings we'd socialise as young teenagers that had worked on the play scheme. And that's where I suddenly realised just what a world was out there, and met people from all walks of life. And that inspired me at that point that I was definitely going travelling.
And of course you had a little black book of addresses and whatever that you could go and look up as you were going around the world as well. Absolutely brilliant. And so now, with this kind of combination of adventure in your background and with habits in your foreground, what is it you're looking for with the kind of, it's not just you on your own, is it? You've got the ESG company behind you, you've got the Franklin and Franklin Covey publishing company behind you as well. So what are you looking for with these children?
So it's more than just the 7 habits. So the 7 habits forms like the core of something called Leader in Me, which is a whole cultural transformation for a school, which sounds like a huge thing to say about a school, but it involves us working with teachers and developing their skill set as leaders, and then how they model to the children. So we introduced this idea of leadership roles, not just for year 5 and 6 in a primary school, for example, but all the way down to reception, so that a 4-year-old coming into a school can take on a leadership role in their classroom, but also potentially anywhere in the school. It's about giving them leadership event opportunity. So to give you an example, I work with a local school who are an infant school, and they looked at some of the things that they currently do, and they took one set of glasses off and they put on a new lens that said, what part of what we currently do are adults doing that children could be doing? Mm-hmm. And so they took a really simple exercise that they do every single year. They thank people who come in and help the school community. So they would normally host after school a kind of tea and cake celebration for people who'd come in to listen to children read, members of the Rotary, different parts of the community. And it would always be teachers, and they would stay after school and they'd have a cup of tea and say thank you. This time, they didn't do it after school. They handed everything over to from reception through to year 2. Yeah. So we're talking 4-year-olds to 6-year-olds. They handed it over, and those children ran an entire afternoon for those people. They made the invitations, they made the cakes, they even decorated every single plate that the adults had. They took them on guided tours around the school. There were no adults involved. They literally just stood on the side and watched, and the children led the whole event. Yeah. And for me, that is an example of allowing children to put habits into practice, and it raises their self-esteem, and it gives them an opportunity to fail, to make mistakes. And that's something in lots of schools we worry about. What will parents say? What will outside visitors say? But
it kind of goes deeper than that. In the conversation that we had earlier, you're actually looking for a societal shift where these habits underlie an awful lot more stuff. It's almost, you're training the teachers to imbue this in the kids. The kids go back home, they discuss it with the parents, and they kind of go on and on. And I've kind of experienced that a bit with my kids. When they were small, they were very much into environmental stuff. I think when you go through reception schools and that sort of stuff, they're very into that. As soon as they get to secondary school, forget it. That's it. They're chucking rubbish all over the place, and they're putting things in the wrong bins, and they don't care about switching the lights on and off, and all that sort of stuff. It just goes out. The environment happens to other people, in my experience as a parent. So how do you prevent that from happening? Well,
just like I mentioned earlier, when you're working with teenagers, it does feel like sometimes they're hard nuts to crack. A lot of their beliefs, a lot of their limiting beliefs are already really set, and that is due to childhood, but it's also due to peer pressure, too cool for school kind of idea. And so working with children from a younger age, working with those 4-year-olds where they are very much more open-minded and like sponges, and getting in there at a level where it becomes cognitive, that they think in that way, actually means that when they get to secondary and they have the opportunity to really think for themselves and be put into situations. I mean, the real sign of leadership is doing the right thing when nobody's looking. And it's those principles, it's that centeredness, that where they notice that actually I could just chuck that recycling on the floor, or I could not put it in the right box, but there'll be something in them that's ingrained because it's coming through the habits that they've had and the principles that they've led. But you mentioned about working with families, and that's interesting because the whole thing around Leader and Me is about developing from the inside out. So we work with the children on what's most important to them. What do they value? What brings them joy? What brings them happiness? And if you were to walk into any kind of family at the moment who may be struggling with their children, may be having problems with their behaviour or things that are going on in their family life, it's very difficult to approach or talk to families because obviously there's an element of stigma involved. Whereas what changes is when you put a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old into that environment and it works from the inside out. So instead of an outside person coming in and saying, would you like some support or help, or which could be resisted, the way the child talks,
the child develops some principles of their own to actually feel, well, this is what I feel from the inside, this is what I'm going to bring into the outside.
And I have to say, I was very sceptical at first about this, but I've seen it with my own eyes. I've spoken to parents who, by their own admission, have learned a lot from their children, and have found that I was working with some families up in Glasgow not that long ago, and the families were saying, my children, we all want a win-win. My children are able to negotiate with me. They're able to kind of work out how we can all win in this situation.
And have you seen these changes? You've actually witnessed it all happening. Yeah. So how does that become a kind of global thing, or a beyond your immediate area of?
So this is another thing that really excites me about Leader and Me, is that Franklin Covey is based in America. It's their own identity, but they have always reached out internationally. And so you have Leader and Me schools in 55 different countries in the world at the moment. And they range from, Cambodia, China, all across the Americas. They're all over the world. And so what's been so inspiring is being able to link those schools together. And so there are schools in this country who are maybe similar to my situation when I was living in Glastonbury and didn't know the outside world. Schools in quite deprived areas where, aspiration is quite low, self-confidence is low in the children, and suddenly they're connecting with schools in Pakistan, in Vietnam, and they are seeing the similarities between them, and they're also seeing the opportunities between them. So they can Google Classroom, for example. They can interview each other. They can do projects together. They create videos and podcasts and share them with each other. And it's really opened the children's eyes to the rest of the world.
And it's a community, a global community of these proactive kids who basically putting first things first, and all of the other good stuff that comes with the book and the practice. And so I kind of, what this podcast is all about, right? We're trying to boil people down to, what are the habits? And you should find this super easy because, it's written on the book, isn't it? There's actually 7 habits. I'm just asking for 5. So all you have to do is a bit of a Sophie's choice and decide which 2 you're dropping, I suppose. But thinking with adventure in mind and your experience, both of adventure and educating people in being leaders, future leaders, what are your, start with your first favourite habit for adventure?
I have to start with habit 1. And that's not just because it's the first one. It's the first one for a reason, because you cannot really realistically achieve anything else unless you have managed to master yourself and recognize how to regulate your mindset and your emotions. And for me, habit 1, it's called Be Proactive. And many people use the word proactive and they believe they understand it. It's the one that all teachers, when you first mention it, yes, we're all proactive. Yes, we take action.
Yeah.
But when you recognize the opposite of being proactive is being reactive, you begin to realise that being proactive is a little bit more complex than that. It's more about practices that you put into practice. So, for example, one of the first things that we teach the children is about this idea that whatever happens in life, whatever situation, whether it's somebody saying something to you, 2 seconds ago, there is always a gap between the stimulus and your response.
Yeah.
And for some of us, that gap is really, really small, and we are quite reactive. But it's about, how do I expand that gap so that I have time to think and choose a response that is going to be the best result, not just for me,
one of the things
but for others.
I found myself saying to my daughter months ago, before I re-picked the book up, and I said, responsibility is made up of two parts.
Yes.
It's your ability to respond.
Yeah.
And you never forget that you've got control over that ability to respond.
And it is a bitter pill to swallow sometimes. If you're in the middle of an argument and somebody turns to you and says, you're choosing to be angry with me right now, obviously you're highly emotive, you don't see that at the time, but helping you understand that actually there is a gap, there is time to choose a different response, and then following that up with, how do you speak, not just out to other people but to yourself. I love asking teenagers, for example, who do you listen to most, is one of my favourite questions. And of course teenagers will always say, or my mum and dad, or my mates. Or
teenagers will never say
if
that.
They're really sucking up, they'll say, oh, you miss, obviously I'm listening to you. But of course the answer is yourself. You listen to every word that comes out of your own mouth, and you listen to every thought.
Stay inside your head.
Every thought. And so habit 1 is also about choosing how you speak, because we know chemically in the brain that certain words and language we use stimulates either cortisol to be released and stress, or the endorphins. And so just being able to say, instead of saying, for example, I have to, I've got to do this, switching it up to, I'm looking forward to doing that. I can't wait to do that. Because one thing we know is the brain doesn't understand sarcasm. So you can literally change your mindset.
I haven't heard that before, but
by the words that you use.
Sense. Yeah.
So proactive language is another part of habit 1. And then we've already touched on it, focusing on what you can control, acknowledging what you can't, but focusing. Your 2 most precious possessions in life are your time and your energy. And habit 1 helps you to focus those 2 things on things that you can actually have an influence on. So when you talk about adventure, we touched on it, whatever you're trying to achieve, whatever aspirations you've got in regards to adventuring, there will be times where you're going to hit barriers, and it's about, how do I talk about that problem? Yeah. Is it a problem or a challenge? This is all about language, and also about, where am I going to focus my time and energy? What can I influence in this situation? So habit 1 has to be my first and favourite habit.
If you had to rescue it on a desert island, then that would be the one
that would
go
be the
for,
one,
rather than the other 4. Nevertheless, I have to press you, and there has to be another 3, another 4 actually, in this one. So, what would be your second habit for adventurous people, or the adventure habits that people could adopt in their lives?
I think it's about vision. It's about recognising that it's okay to have dreams and aspirations, no matter how crazy they might seem to other people. And actually, the more you can visualise and create what it is you want, or who you want to be in your mind, the more chance you've got of achieving it.
So that's what you call the first creation.
Yeah.
The second creation is actually bringing it into reality.
Yeah, and the way I like to describe it with the children is, we talk about an aeroplane, and we say that, when you get on an aeroplane, it's got a predetermined flight path. It's computerized, it knows where it's going to land most of the time. But whilst you're on that plane as a passenger, you've got no idea how much it gets knocked off course by the weather, animals, birds, other airplanes, because it always realigns itself. It gets back on track. So we talk about having a mission, having a kind of visualization of who you want to be as a person, for example. It's not just about what you're going to achieve or what you're going to possess, in terms of belongings. It's about, who do I want to be as a person? Yeah. And so a quick and easy way to do that is to say, give me 3 adjectives of how you would like somebody to describe you. So as a dad, as a brother or sister, as an adventurer, what would be the 3 adjectives that you would want somebody to say about you? Not that they would necessarily say today, but you would want them to say to you about you in the future. So I'm going to push that back to you, David. What would the 3 adjectives be?
Well, I kind of I would have to steal from the guy that was on podcast 2 now, a lovely chap called Chris Howard, who's walked various coastlines and done amazing things in his life, and it's kindness, curiosity, and just determinism. I think just being determined to carry on regardless, because and for him those 3 things make up his way of coping with all the problems that he comes across on
so my next question would be, are you those things every day?
I'd say no. I'd say
and that's a good honest answer, because we're human beings and we're not everything every day. But if you were to put those 3 words up somewhere in your vision on a daily basis, on the front of your diary or just above your front door, and you saw those words every day, what would that make you do?
I'd probably think about them more often, and it would probably find its way into my day-to-day doings, my habits. And I think it would probably be quite a sensible way to do it. It's funny that we don't all do it, is it? So.
And it just makes us reflect on, how was I those things today, and anything that I wasn't, what will I do differently tomorrow? And that's life, isn't it? It's you live day by day. You think about, if I wasn't kind today, how could I rectify that tomorrow? If I didn't have the patience or the determination today, how could I do it differently tomorrow? And that's what habit 2 is about. It's about having that vision and then working towards it, knowing you're going to be knocked off course, but knowing that because you've got a vision, you'll pull yourself back on course, because life is going to throw curveballs at us and knock us off course all the time. So that for me is a really big part of adventure and aspiration, and knowing that.
And I love the analogy as well, because it all comes down to compasses and all of that sort of stuff. So
maps.
As long as you keep an awareness of where you're at, one of these fellas there, then you'll stay on track to keep the end in mind. So visualization, and you've got proactive so far. What's the 3rd?
So whenever you ask anybody why they haven't done something, generally speaking, the answer is, I haven't got time.
Sure.
So time is we need to be controlling our time as opposed to time controlling us. And we've all got exactly the same 24 hours of the day. It's how we choose to use it. Now, I am no saint, and time management is something I still struggle with massively. But habit 3 for me is a very simple concept it's called the big rock theory. But the idea is that you look at what's most important to you. And so if I was to name, 5 things that are really important to me, my family would be one of them, my health would be another one, my work with education. And you look at those things and you start to, instead of just making to-do lists, you start to mind map, and you start to think, okay, this week, what do I need to do that relates to my family? What do I need to do that relates to my work in education? And what do I need to do with my health? And you then look at your week ahead and you put those big rocks in first. And the basic principle is that, if you had a vessel and you had sand, pebbles and rocks, and you all chucked it all in together, it wouldn't fit. But if you put the big rocks in first, then the pebbles, and then you pour the sand in, it will all fit, because the sand is the little things that actually distract us most of the time, that extra scrolling on your phone, that watching
I get it. So this is a prioritization thing, and an exercise to work out where your big rocks are, the things that are most important to you. And it brings you back to the kind of, there's a visualization, go back to your previous one, of visualizing your own funeral, which is actually quite a good way to see, what people will say about you when you're gone. Then while you're still alive, you can do something about that. You can turn up the volume a bit on that. I love that analogy. And so prioritization and first things first, I guess that's the essence of habit 3. You got two more to have. What's going to come in next? I'm interested by the Sophie's choice on which ones are going to not make the cut here.
Yes, interesting. So for me, I think win-win is a huge one. And it comes down to, ultimately, again, it comes back to mindset. Do you see the world from a scarcity mentality?
Yeah.
Without even realising it, because we're conditioned to think that way. It's our default mechanism, whether it's nurture or nature, education, the world of business. We are being led down that route of competition, that there's not enough for everybody and we've got to compete. And the reality is, if you have that mindset, then you're focused on lack. You know, if you have something, it means I don't have it, and therefore that I'm lacking. Whereas an abundance mentality is always thinking there's enough for everyone and we can both win in this situation. So how can we collaborate? How can we work better together? An abundance mentality has a real focus on gratitude and recognizing what you do have, which links back to habit 1, because do you see that glass as half empty or do you see it as half full? And if you focus your time and energy on things that you do have, you will bring more towards you, as opposed to focusing on what you don't have.
Yeah.
So that
and
mindset
actually, you
of
can be
abundance.
grateful for the things you don't have as well. I remember, first time thinking about this, and it was like, if you see a Ferrari, you know you can't afford it, but just be happy that it's there, that you can look upon it, and that it can be something that makes you smile. You know, that sort of thing. Quite like that. So, and the win-win, do you find that in the pages of The Art of the Deal, for example, by D. Trump? And
It's interesting when you learn about habit 4 and think win-win. It seems so obvious and it's so easily said, flippantly said. You know, we all want a win-win. It's only when you start to think about what the alternatives are that you really think, actually, what does a lose-win look like? If you go into any situation with a lose-win attitude, you've got two kinds of people. You've got people who are like Eeyore and everything doesn't go their way. You know, their whole way they look at life is that, you know, there's no point me trying because I'll never be successful. You know, there's no point me even imagining traveling to, you mentioned Asia and walking around Asia. Why would I try that? It was never going to work for me. And the other type of person you get with a lose-win attitude is a pleaser. And you'll find in education, it's full of pleasers, as is the care system, because everybody always puts everybody else first. And it's all very much about, I will, at my own detriment sometimes,
myself
I will do something for you. Because that's the very nature of the care industry and also education. And what Habit 4 teaches you is that you don't have to lose in order to achieve that. You can go into a situation and turn your courage up and level it with your consideration so that your needs and the other person's needs are being met. And that's a really powerful message for children as well, because you'll often see children, there'll be some that have got a win-lose attitude and they take over situations and they dominate other children because they're automatically going in with, well, I'm going to get what I want out of this situation. And it's how do you navigate that and help them see that when they go into a setting, working in a collaborative situation, how do they turn down their courage and turn up their consideration? And vice versa for that shy child, how do I turn up my courage and turn up my courage and turn down my consideration a little bit so that I'm not walked all over?
And a lot of this does come down to the language that you choose to use in looking for, it's very difficult to go and sell a product to someone because it's good. But if you try and come from the perspective that there's something in it for them, it's going to unlock something new for them, and that's actually going to be recompensed in the other case for money or whatever, then it becomes a much easier sell to do, and both parties leave feeling happy. I think there's a lot to learn from win-win, and you've got a 5th habit that you're going to choose now.
So I think when you look at the habits, the final habit 7, it's around sharpening your saw, which I don't know if you know the fable, but the fable was written that a man trying to chop down a tree with a blunt saw and a stranger walks past and says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "It's not obvious, I'm trying to chop this tree down." And he says, "Well, why don't you just stop for a minute and sharpen your saw? You'll get the tree down much quicker." And of course his response is, "I don't have time." And habit 7 is about renewal, it's about balance, it's about recognizing that you can't really do anything, any of the other habits, or be successful in life if you do not look after yourself. You are the tool that is needed to live your life. So it really looks at your physical health, your mental health, your spiritual health, and your relationship health.
This is great, and this has come out through the other adventurers we've interviewed in this series, and they look at it in kind of almost being ever ready.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they exercise every day, they get themselves mentally sorted out every day, and it's because they don't know what's likely to hit next, really. Mm-hmm. And so you're just ready for it, and that seems to be the adventurer's way of doing things.
Yeah. And what's interesting when you get that balance between all four, there'll always be one that you're not necessarily as tuned in with. And when we talk about the spiritual side, it's not necessarily religion, although that can be the case. I like to describe it as things that lift your spirit. So it might be walking with nature, it could be reading a book or listening to music, but looking at doing something in your life that brings you joy. And then also relationships. So one of the key things about the relationship part is recognizing that everybody in your life has got an emotional bank account, and you can make deposits in somebody's bank account and you can make withdrawals. And if you regularly make deposits, then your bank account's going to be full with that person, and the odd time you need to make a withdrawal, which we all do because we're all human, it's not a big deal. That person copes. But when you have regularly taken from somebody's bank account, you've let them down in some way, that makes it more challenging when there's a big withdrawal, and relationships can be damaged. And so when we talk about currency, we talk about making a deposit. What does that look like? Well, it's different for different people, and often we tend to give in a way that we think is going to be received as a deposit, but actually it's not their currency. And so we then become resentful that, well, they don't appreciate what I do and everything I've done for this person, because it's not necessarily their currency. It might be our currency, but not theirs. It's interesting with children because their highest currency is generally quality time. They just want time with us. And yet our busy lives mean that that's quite difficult to do.
So that's the thing they value the most, that's the thing that they're looking for, but it might not be the thing that you think you've got to give them, actually.
And we may do lots of acts of service. We may be, making their packed lunches and driving them to school and doing all of these things that they're not necessarily recognising. And I can tell you now that no teenager opens their drawer and says, "Thank you so much, Mum, for washing and ironing my clothes." That's not their currency. No. It will be, can I have a lift to my mate's house? Can I have some money for something? And yet that wash basket is literally my emotional bank account. And when my children put their washing in it, my bank account's topped up, and the odd time that they drop a sock on the way to the wash basket, I'll scoop it up and chuck it in. But if they consistently leave it all over their bedroom, then my bank account is low, and that's when the nagging and the frustration comes out. And I think when we are able to understand that if a relationship isn't going well, it's maybe because our bank account with that person's low, and what can we do about it?
Make those deposits. And it's that kind of the song that's in my head at the moment is "Lean on Me." I think that's just a great song about friendship, and you invest in that friendship because you don't know when you might need that friendship to work backwards for you as well. So that's great. So you've gone for the 5 habits, you've gone for be proactive, you've gone for visualization, time management, and aiming for the win-win, and then finally sharpening the saw, which is quite interesting because I it's a while since I've read that book, but I always thought that sharpening the saw was about keeping the education going. And when I finished my degree, got my first couple of jobs, and then started doing open university stuff, all that sort of stuff, it was always, for me, it was about educating yourself in new areas. I hadn't really looked on it as developing those bank accounts with my nearest and dearest, and expanding group of people that work around me. And I think there's things I can see now in my own life where I can see that's caused problems. But there's also very encouraging things that I can see now. I mean, around the podcast and the way that the business goes and the way that adventurers have responded back. I can see that there's a very positive side to it there. But you can begin to look through that filter and see where your life needs a bit of work on it. And so, I mean, really, Kirsty, I guess everybody's probably sold like I am on, wow, I want my kids to go through that and get some education. I guess that's what you look for. Is it parents putting pressure on the head teachers to adopt the the 7 habits and what was the name of the program?
Leader in Me.
The Leader in Me program.
I think our biggest challenge is the fact that it's about knowing about Leader in Me and publicising it in a way that schools and parents and other educational institutions know about it.
Put a link on the podcast.
And we are doing conferences. We're trying to talk to head teachers. Obviously, we know that finances are very challenging for schools, and what we're offering is at a really low rate. It's not an expensive program to put into schools, and certainly not when you work it out on a pupil by pupil basis.
Yeah.
Because again, it's for every child, every teacher.
It's a win for society,
Yeah.
really, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you see it working its way through the generations, then it really is.
Yeah. We're very much about modelling to the students. A primary school teacher said to me once, "We are the book that the children read every day," and that is so true. That the children that you're working with in a school, you are one of their strongest role models. You're with them every day, and they watch how you behave, and they pick up on where things aren't congruent, where you are saying one thing and behaving in another way. And so what we're looking with schools is that we're helping on all levels develop leadership, from senior leadership right down to that child's first day in school, from the cleaners and the caretaker and the people working in the lunchtime clubs and things. Everybody's involved, so that they're all speaking the same language and the children are seeing it being modelled to them. So it's a huge transformational change for a school. And
it's a wonderful thing to see. So details will be on the podcast blurb. Do get in touch with Kirsty and the ESG, and thank you very much for being on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And adventurers, petition your head teachers and get your kids, get the next generation to be as great a leader as you are.
Absolutely.